Very good.
Cool. So welcome everyone. Thank you, Audrey, for the lovely introduction, and to Product Tank for inviting me to give that talk. It's going to be roughly 40 minutes. So if you have a chance to grab a hot beverage or a glass of wine, I would strongly encourage that. It's always nicer. As Audrey mentioned, I have an interest in psychology, and that started for me many years ago when I first graduated from the university and started my first full-time job. I both missed the learning environment, and at the same time I had an opportunity to participate in a lot of user research and user testing. And that started that interest in psychology. I kept my full-time day job, but I also went back to uni to study psychology. After that, I decided to keep to my career path that I already had, and psychology for me is more of a hobby and something I'm interested in than obviously my job. I'm a product manager. So part of the psychology is cognitive psychology as well, and that's actually, I think, my favorite part of psychology. You don't have to talk about emotions too much. It's not something that I like to do. So that's a safe space for me, cognitive psychology, and something that also helps in my job. So today, you know, the title of that talk is Cognitive Bias in Product Management, and I'm going to talk about cognitive bias and its definition. But I'm also going to talk about cognitive bias in product management. The main part that I would like to focus on is whether we can do anything about cognitive bias. Can we mitigate our cognitive biases? And because life is not just work, I also want to talk about being a better negotiator. So next time when you go to buy a car or you go to negotiate your rent or anything else, you probably will have some tips and tricks, or at least you will be aware of the tricks that salespeople are using on you. I know that there is a lot of articles about cognitive bias in general and cognitive bias in product management as well, but I quite often feel that those articles lack proper bias explanation. They usually also don't give a lot of information about bias mitigation, other than presenting top 5 cognitive biases in product management, and now that you are aware of them, you should be able to eliminate them. I'm going to talk today about that it's not as easy, and one of our questions in the poll was around whether building that awareness is enough to eliminate our biases, cognitive biases. And I'm going to talk about that more when we get to that stage, but the short answer is no, although many people in that poll said yes, it's possible if we are aware of them. It's unfortunately not so simple. So let's dive in. What is cognitive bias? Cognitive bias is a systematic pattern of deviation from rationality, which occurs due to the way our cognitive system works. So cognitive biases cause us to be irrational in the way we gather, process, search, evaluate information, but it also impacts our decision making. Cognitive psychology is a relatively new field of psychology, and decision-making and cognitive biases are even a younger field in that. But how it all started, many years ago, before those two men changed that thinking, researchers and scientists assumed that we are all rational beings, that in a natural way, intuitively, we make rational decisions. Those two men, and some others as well, but those two men changed that thinking. The man on the left side is Amos Tversky, and the man next to him is Daniel Kahneman. You might know the second name better because he's the author of a hugely popular book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he's also a Nobel Prize winner. That also always helps with name recognition. But how it all started? It started with a so-called Big Bang between those two guys. Daniel Kahneman in 1969 invited Tversky to give a talk in one of his classes. They were both at that time teachers at the Jerusalem University. And Kahneman heard about Tversky. They were in the same department, although they were exploring a very different fields of psychology. Tversky was already exploring decision-making, and Kahneman was exploring vision processing, so very different topics. But he invited him, Tversky presented his talk. Kahneman found it absolutely fascinating and interesting, but also he deeply disagreed with Amos Tversky. And they had a very public disagreement about that talk. That disagreement is known as the Big Bang. And that was actually the start of the very long friendship and collaboration on decision making. The whole legacy is based on only 8 papers they created together in the 70s. Initially at the Jerusalem University, later on they moved to the US to continue their studies. In 2002, Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. Amos Tversky unfortunately passed away in 1996 and he missed out on that award. That is only award to people who are still alive. The outcome of the research is the theory of 2 systems, and this is also how they explain cognitive biases. So they explain how our whole cognitive system works, and they actually talk about 2 different systems. System 1 is responsible for intuitive processing. It's very fast, it's automating, it's effortless. It's highly influenced by our emotions, and it can run multiple processes at the same time. System 2 is very different. System 2 is responsible for conscious reasoning. It is slow, controlled, and it feels like effort. So if you feel like you are thinking hard, you are probably using your system 2 at that time. It's mostly detached from emotions and it cannot process too many thinking processes at the same time. I asked at the beginning, how many decisions do you think on average we make every day? And the correct answer to that is 35,000 every day, 35,000 decisions. 98% of those decisions are processed by system 1. So we don't really feel like we are deciding. It's effortless. It just happens. The remaining 2% are processed by system 2. To give everyone, I think, a better example maybe of how those 2 systems works is imagine a situation when you drive a car. You have experience driving a car. You are not a new driver. The car is not new for you as well. The road is empty. The weather is beautiful. You can drive the car without really thinking about everything that you need to do. It just happens. At the same time, you probably are able to talk to your passengers, listen to music or podcast, radio, change stations, and so on. But now imagine that it starts to rain, the road suddenly gets very busy, and you really want to take over that car in front of you that is slowing you down. Now it feels like effort. You need to decide, is it a good time for taking over or not? You cannot really listen to your passengers anymore. You don't even, you can hear them talking, but you don't really process what they are saying. This is where system 2 kicks in and takes control of that process. At least it should kick in, and we should be making those decisions not in an automated way because the situation is more complicated. I also like this example because it shows that cognitive biases happen to different people at different time. Whether the cognitive bias is going to happen and whether our system 1 can run things or whether we need system 2 depends on our cognitive skills, our experience, our personality, but also environment. So things out of our control as well. Now I'm going to show you a very short brain teaser, and I'm going to give you just 5 seconds to think about the correct answer before I'm going to show it on my screen. So let's go. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And the correct answer is that the bat costs $1.05, while the ball costs 5 cents. If you didn't know that example, it's quite a popular one, there is a very high chance that your answer was different, that your answer was that the bat is $1 and the ball is 10 cents. If that's the case, don't feel bad, because it was just your system 1 intuitively answering that question. 2, roughly half of Harvard students answer that question in the same way, that it's $1 for the bat and 10 cents for the ball. So what just happened to many of us? Your system 1 provided an intuitive automatic response. Your system 2 did not activate, or it did, but failed to control system 1. So that automatic answer was intuitive and it was close, to correct, but not correct. A couple of different things might have happened there as well. For one, the example mentions that the bat costs $1 more. If you don't see the more, then you remember just $1 and you get attached to that number. So it's really easy to make that intuitive distinction into $1.10. One other thing that might help you understand your own cognitive biases and understand when they happen to you is the distinction of cognitive biases into hot and cold biases. Hot biases are motivated by emotional consideration, like maintaining a positive self-image. And I'm going to talk a lot about those hot biases and how we do a lot without even thinking about that to maintain that positive self-image. One example of that hot bias might be self-serving bias. This bias causes us to attribute our success to us and our actions and see the failure as the fault of the environment. The other type of bias is the cold bias, which occur due to emotionally neutral processes, like limitations of our cognitive ability, for example, our memory. So it's not emotional, it's just how our memory works. One of the examples might be the telescoping effect. It's really interesting and it makes us see things that happened not long ago as something that happened a long time ago, and vice versa. Things that happened a long time ago as something that was pretty close to now. So why do cognitive biases exist? Well, they exist because we have 35,000 decisions every day to make, and many of them are handled by that automatic system one. In many cases, that's enough. That answer that we give, that decision that we make is good enough. The intuition quite often is right. It doesn't mean that every time our system one kicks in, the answer, the decision is bad. In many cases, it is good enough or good. It doesn't also mean that our system two is always right. It is not. But cognitive biases and the mental shortcuts that we have, they simplify complex processes. They speed up decision-making processes. They save our brain for completely overheating every day and feeling exhausted at the end of the day. Some of them, in some situations, might be bad for us, but in many, they are good or good enough. Let's take the confirmation bias. It's one of the well-known biases, and it causes us to look for information that confirms what we already know or believe in. And in many cases, when you think about that, that simply makes sense. To start thinking or exploration with what you already know, instead of just going for a completely new explanation. So one thing to remember from this section is that that no one is bias-free. We all have cognitive biases, and they are here for a reason. So let's now talk about cognitive biases in product management. I like this visualization because it's very easy on your eye. It's really nice from visual perspective. It presents a lot of cognitive biases that are known and researched. I think the current list of cognitive biases is 180 in total, but I'm not going to focus today on going through all of them or even half of them. Instead, I decided to pick a handful of them that I think are really important from product management perspective. And sure, my own biases probably played a role here. So you might want to go through the cognitive bias list, think about how you work and how you think, and maybe create your own personalized list of cognitive biases. But I think that many of them will be pretty universal for many people in product management. So when we research and do product discovery, two cognitive biases that I would like to focus on is anchoring and confirmation bias. Anchoring is a really interesting cognitive bias. It causes us to focus on the first piece of information that we are given. That might be an information that was given to you by your CEO, by your customer, by your colleague from the next desk. It doesn't really matter. We get attached to that information and we then compare all other pieces of information to that initial information we were given. The bias also occurs when the information that we were given is completely random. Unfortunately, it also occurs when if we are told that this information is random and it doesn't matter for our decision making. In one study, researchers asked people to give last 2 digits of their social security number, so a completely random number. Then the same group of people were given a number of everyday items like laptop, water bottle, and so on. And they were asked to estimate a price they would be willing to pay for those items. What is interesting is that those people with higher random social security numbers were willing to pay more for those items than people who had significantly lower random social security numbers, even though they knew that this is unrelevant and random. But unfortunately, this bias influences everyone, not just product managers. In a different study, judges who were asked by prosecutors to give a higher penalty were giving those higher penalties to people than those who were asked for something lower, for a lower penalty. So that can influence people's life as well. It also drives many other biases. I'm going to mention that later on. Confirmation bias, it makes us focus on evidence that fits with our existing beliefs. It can hinder our fact collection and impacts decision making because we don't have the full picture. We are just focusing to confirm what we already know. In some situations, it's good enough. In many, it's unfortunately not. One of the examples that I can think of, think about that you own a restaurant and your strong belief is that hard work means success. And you notice that your revenue is going down. At the same time, you also notice that your staff members are taking longer lunch breaks, and you jump to a conclusion that this is impacting your revenue and this is the only explanation for that. So you focus on talking to your staff and making sure that they are taking shorter lunch breaks, making them unhappy, but it probably won't impact your revenue because the problem might have been somewhere else. It also has interesting socio-political implication because we don't really like to read or hear information that doesn't fit with what we believe in. We quite often don't really try to understand the other side of a political or other argument. And I think this is so important to remember in that election year that we have here in New Zealand, but also in the US. That we sometimes don't want to hear the other side because it makes us upset. So we don't read, we don't hear them out to try to understand. Next, that discussion, what should we build? And there are obviously a number of criteria that we take into consideration, and we want to avoid building that beautiful yet totally inaccessible palace on water. A couple of cognitive biases that I would like to highlight here is the bandwagon effect. It is a very useful shortcut for quick decision making because it depends on social cues, and our intuition tells us to go with the majority. If the majority does something, they are probably right. And that intuition in many cases is right. And it allows us not to think, just go with what everyone else is doing. But in product planning and product management and decision making here, it can really prevent us from being innovative, not seeing that opportunity to do something completely different on a company level. It also can cause us to just copy whatever our competitors are doing instead of focusing on building that something different and differentiate ourselves on the market. Think about a meeting that you might have with a bigger group, a workshop. When you try to make a decision, think about a new solution or brainstorm some ideas. That can happen in that environment as well. Planning fallacy bias, I think it's one of my favorite ones. We probably all had those projects that were underestimated in terms of time, risk, money needed to complete a task. And that might have happened because of the planning fallacy bias. It's such an interesting one because it also happens to people when they have experience in estimating and completing very similar tasks. And it happens to us mostly due to 3 reasons. One of them is that most people are optimistic. So that question initially that I think when we stopped sharing the screen, most people were leaning towards pessimistic. Actually, most people are optimistic. And there is even a very interesting optimism bias. I think it's one of my favorite ones. It's so interesting. I even did a talk last year just about this one bias. So we underestimate because we are optimistic. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is that, and it's connected to anchoring, that our estimation that we get quite often is based on very initial conversation, very initial idea, not a complete idea or set of requirements. So it's easy to imagine that, you know, coffee machine conversation that you might have with a developer. You present your idea and they give us some estimation, and we get attached to that initial estimation. Then our scope obviously gets bigger, requirements change, and so on and so on. But we don't really get a new estimation. We still have that initial estimation in our mind, and we talk about that one. The last reason, which is also important, is the social pressure plays a role here. We all want to seem as people who are competent in our job. So quite often when we are asked how long it is going to take you to complete task A or task B, we underestimate, because one, we are optimistic, two, we want to seem efficient and well organized, and so on. The last one here is the sunk cost fallacy. It is tendency to continue if we already invested in a project or a task, and that investment can be a money investment, time, effort, it doesn't really matter as long as we already invested. And we continue despite the fact that the current cost already outweighs the future potential benefits. So we know that it doesn't make sense, but we continue regardless. On a more personal level, it can cause people to stay with a partner they are unhappy with because they spent many years with them, and they see that in a way as an investment. So they don't want to lose that if they leave that partner. And this is where we are being irrational, because those years that we spent with that person, they are lost regardless. So whether we are going to continue or not, we are not going to get back that time. We lost that time. It happens on a company and business level as well. One of the more interesting examples here was a collaboration between British and French government when they were building the Concorde supersonic plane. Very early on in the process, they already knew that this adventure, this project, won't be a viable one long term, but they decided to continue regardless. They already were invested in that, and they didn't want to say, hey, we know it doesn't make any sense after 3 years of research, let's stop. Evaluation of success. So now that our feature or product is out on the market, we want to see how it's doing. And a couple of cognitive biases that can come into play here is the ostrich effect, and that's just avoiding potentially unpleasant information. And we can avoid that information in many ways. That can be just physical avoidance. You know that someone wants to talk to you and they might have that unpleasant information. So you might want to avoid that person. You might not go to a meeting if you expect some unpleasant information over there, or you can interpret the information presented in a way that it's less threatening to you. And again, that's one of those biases when we try to just protect our self-esteem. And so we just avoid that information. We can avoid that information even though we realize that we won't be able to make a good decision if we don't get that information. Self-serving bias, I already mentioned that one. It also helps us maintain positive self-esteem. External factors contribute to failures, that's how we see that, but success is attributed to our own actions or traits. So if our product or feature is successful, it's going to be because we had great ideas, we worked really hard, we didn't give up early on, and so on. But if that was not a success, if that was a failure, we can contribute to that external circumstances, the environment, and so on. So if that was not a success, we can say, there was nothing we could do, the economy is so bad, no one would succeed on this market. The competitor opened up just 2 doors down and they have a huge marketing budget. Nothing we could do about that. It can also obviously hinder our understanding of what happened because we have this easy distinction. Success, it was us. Failure, it was everyone else and the environment. So we don't really dig any deeper into understanding what really happened. But it can also make collaboration with your team members more difficult. If you attribute successes to yourself, but you might see your team members as the reason for your failure or not the success that you wanted. So if that's not very successful, the project has been delayed. It's because of those developers who gave us the terrible estimation. It's not because of us. Survivor bias, it makes us focus solely on success and completely forget about the failures in us or other people as well. I think that we all know and like the amazing stories of people who survived or succeeded despite sometimes a very adverse conditions. But not learning from failures is that missed opportunity to learn from them and to understand what happened in our projects or other people. It is much easier to find online a great success stories than stories of failure. You can find them, they are just not so readily ready for you. When I was preparing that slide deck, I also noticed that my own bias shows up here on this slide. I gave the title of this slide Evaluation of Success because myself, as we all probably have that survivor bias and like to focus on success instead of also looking at failures. But I decided to keep that title because I think it's to some degree ironic that this cognitive bias is visible here in a talk about cognitive biases. Learning and retros. Rosy retrospection is a cognitive bias that causes us to judge past more positively than the present. It's our tendency to forget neutral and negative events that we just have. This is how our memory works. We remember what was positive in a much better way than the things that didn't go that well. But at the same time, it can have a different reason. It can be a justification of our own actions. Imagine that you were involved in a project that didn't go very well. You might be looking for positive in this project because otherwise you would have to admit that maybe you didn't do a great job. So it's an interesting cognitive bias because it's not cold, it's not hot. It can be one or the other or a mixture of both. Hindsight bias is otherwise known as I knew it all along. You maybe said it yourself. You probably heard other people saying that. When something unexpected happens and there are people who say, hey, I knew it all along, I'm not surprised. You might be, but I'm not. Why it happens? It happens because we like to think that the world around us makes sense and that we can expect things and that the things that we expect will happen. We don't really like surprises in that way. One of the examples of that is the 2016 US election, and I'm sorry for everyone for whom it is a sensitive subject for bringing that up, but the polls before the election showed that it's going to be Hillary Clinton who is going to win. As we all know, it didn't happen. It was Trump who won the election, and there were many tweets and articles next day who said, hey, I knew it all along. It's problematic in product management because it may stop us exploring why something happened and why we didn't know that it might happen, because we knew it all along. So there is no need for exploration or trying to understand. Hiring and people management. It's not core product management, but people are so important in product management, and whether you are hiring manager or not in your organization, it's good to be at least aware of those cognitive biases. Halo effect is probably one of the better known cognitive biases. You can find it in many places over the internet, especially in articles about hiring people. Positive perception in one area influences our perception in another, quite often completely unrelated area. One of the most popular examples is that attractive people get hired more often, they get promoted more often and easily, they are offered higher salaries and so on. The horns effect is the exact opposite of that. Your negative perception in one area will influence your perception in other areas. So why does it happen? It happens because we like things to be complete and things to make sense, and our brain creates a full picture with one single information that we have. So imagine being in an interview, a candidate comes in, and the only thing that you know about them at this stage most likely will be, you know, they looks. And you can build a whole story around that whole narrative just from this one information. And that whole story will be biased and most likely inaccurate. But this is what happens. The other interesting one is the recency bias, tendency to remember the most recent information best. And I think this one probably won't have so much influence on hiring and that process, but definitely on performance reviews. So it's important to remember about this one, whether you are people manager or you are an employee that will be going into that performance review, that your manager might have that bias and they might remember the last 3 weeks of your work instead of, you know, remembering the whole year if that's an annual performance review. And it can be good for you in some cases if the whole year was not great, but you really did everything you could in those 3 weeks. But it can also be the opposite. You had a great year overall and last 3 weeks just not so good. It's good to go prepared to that meeting and have prepared a list of all the things that you did this year and all the successes that you might have had. And because we are on the hiring and people management slide, I want to mention that Pushpay is hiring for product manager. The ad is on our website. So if you are considering a next move in your career and you are interested in product management, then go to pushpay.com, have a look, and maybe apply for that role if that sounds like something you would be interested in. Cool, so now let's talk about the bias and bias mitigation. And Anthony, if we could maybe use the poll right now that we have. It's very short, it's just one question.
Poll should be up now.
Yeah, it is up. Should we wait or can I go? I don't want to mess the poll.
I'll leave it up until you let me know to end it.
Can you see how many people answered the question?
We're at 38 of 62 so far.
Cool, so let's maybe give a minute before we move on.
42. So far, we're quite biased towards no, I think. So it's like 60-40 to no. Yep, 47. I think we've got most of the votes now.
And what's the answer?
So we're at 62% saying no, they haven't tried bias mitigation, and 38% yes.
Cool. That's actually more yeses than I expected, which is great that people have that experience and they try to do something about the cognitive biases. So bias, as we know, can fog or cloud our thinking, make it less clear than it should be. And the bias mitigation is a process through which the influence of cognitive biases is reduced. It helps us think in a more rational, clear way. But does it work? I don't unfortunately have a great information here. And the short answer is that it depends, and it's something that is not easy. Results in many research show that how successful and how effective bias mitigation is really depends on the type of technique that you use, the type of cognitive bias that you try to reduce, and also your cognitive style of thinking and so on. So unfortunately, there will be no advice, do this and your cognitive biases are gone forever. One thing that we know through many studies is that awareness alone is not enough. It is either completely not effective, or if it is effective, it's usually short term, and also for only for some cognitive biases. I think one of the questions that we had at the very beginning was, can you reduce or remove cognitive biases through awareness? And I think it was leaning towards yes. I think it was pretty optimistic. So unfortunately, the answer to that question is no. Awareness alone is not enough to reduce or eliminate the bias, cognitive biases. So let's have a look to see what else can we do instead of just learning about those biases and how they work and what are their names and what do they do to us. One of the things that we can do is metacognition, which is just understanding about how we think. It's thinking about thinking. So we would have to go this one level high up and see, you know, from that perspective, what is our thinking style. It's the knowledge of, you know, my own thinking process, how we learn, how we make decisions, what are our strengths and weaknesses. Am I someone who under stress is still able to make a decent decision, or do I completely, you know, fall apart under stress and time pressure? Do I need to be in a quiet room alone for 15 minutes to really concentrate and think? Or I don't care. I'm one of those people who can, you know, have the noise, people walking around and they don't care. Its metacognition is ability to self-reflect and self-correct that behavior. So it's a first step after awareness. You have to understand what is your style of thinking. It's thinking about thinking, and I think it might sound strange, but it's really useful, not just for bias mitigation, but generally understanding how we process information and how we make decisions. So metacognition and awareness are good first steps, but they are not enough, and more can be done as well. We can also create good conditions for ourselves when we know that there will be a day, for example, next day at work, we will be doing some important decisions, or we'll be creating a survey for research and so on. And those conditions can be internal. For example, try to get enough rest and sleep. Maybe don't have that extra cup of coffee if it makes you all nervous, and so on. External conditions, it's just creating enough time and space for people to work in a better environment. So having a room that will be separated maybe from the rest of the office, maybe not scheduling important meetings just before lunch or just before 5 p.m. when most of the people will be either hungry or looking at their watch and, you know, thinking about already leaving the office, getting the kids and so on. So you can mitigate to some extent bias also by creating and improving those both internal and external conditions. The other interesting one is self-distance. Many of those biases that I described are there because we try to protect our self-esteem. Those are those hot biases that usually are influenced by our emotions. So instead of, to be more, to eliminate those biases, you should create some distance between those problems, those decisions that you try to make, and yourself, which is difficult because you are the decision maker maybe as well. So instead of asking, what should I do? What advice would you give to a friend? Would you change your decision if that was not you, but your friend or colleague? Or would that advice be exactly the same? Try seeing yourself from a perspective of people you talk to, and try avoiding first-person language. That last one I personally find very strange, and this is not something that I'm able to implement with a straight face and actually focus on that instead of just laughing, but maybe it's going to work for you. So instead of asking, what was my role in this project? How did I contribute to the outcome? You can ask, by you or he, she, just avoid that first-person language to create a little bit of padding between you and the problem. But because we know that we all have cognitive biases, and that's not something we can avoid completely or eliminate completely, we can also be better prepared for those biases when they come in. So we can change our product management process slightly. We can have peer review, so we can avoid just confirmation bias. For example, we will ask someone else to review our documentation, our assumptions, and that might be helpful. If you can, don't be your own researcher. I know that it's not always possible. We are sometimes a team of one doing almost everything. But if you can, ask someone else to help you. If they won't be able to conduct the research, maybe they will be able to just give you some advice, review your questions, review your research assumptions and goals for that research and so on, to make sure that you are not just trying to confirm what you already know, but actually you are trying to learn something new. Plan retros early to avoid having those rose-tinted glasses on your nose when you try to learn something from the project that just ended. Pay attention to things that didn't go well. Don't focus only on the success stories and survivors. Look at the failures and those people who didn't make it as well. And favor statistical data over anecdotal evidence. So once you start your presentation to your stakeholders, and you will have interesting anecdote to start with, just to get the attention, people will remember that anecdote most likely after the meeting. And even if later on your data, your numbers won't confirm that that anecdotal evidence, it won't matter anymore. This is what they will be. This is what they will remember after the presentation. You can also implement some checkpoints and reminders in your documentation. So if you have a space in your documentation, for example, for estimation, make sure that this is the estimation for the scope and the requirements that you currently have, not something that you got early on from the development team and you never got back to them and asked them to re-estimate. And document your assumptions and expected results early on and throughout the process. So if you have specific expectations of how this feature or product is going to perform, what will happen if things don't go well, document all of that. So later on, when things actually will happen, you cannot claim, I knew it all along. You will have that documented and you will be able to go back and see what you actually expected and what happened later on. But most importantly, try to go slow. I know it's very difficult. It is personally also difficult for me because I'm someone who is usually pretty quick in making decisions and just going with work. And you know, we all have probably more to do than we would like to. So it's difficult to slow down, but it can be really helpful. Take more time to go through all information that you have. Pause when you encounter information that upsets you. It most likely means that you encounter that confirmation bias. There's information that you don't agree with and it's against your beliefs or information that you have. So if that happens to you, if you have that feeling in your stomach that you don't want to look at that data anymore, or you don't want to hear that presentation anymore, just take a break, 5 minutes, and come back to that later on. I also would like to talk about S.L.O.W model. I think it can be really helpful with cognitive biases. It was designed for doctors in hospitals who, unfortunately, like all of us, they have cognitive biases as well. In their case, obviously, any bad decision influenced by cognitive biases can have terrible consequences. It's people's life and health. So what was designed for them is this S.L.O.W model that in some hospitals in the US, they have it on their pads and they can just go with the pen and check for check boxes after they make a decisions to make sure that this is the decision, that the decision was based on data and facts that they have. So what is that S.L.O.W model? It's basically for checkpoints for questions. Sure about that? Why? Are you sure about that decision? If yes, great, but why? What information do you have that makes you so confident that this is the right decision? Look at the data. What is lacking? Is there something that is missing from your data set? You probably are not ready to make a good decision if that's the case. What if the opposite is true? Think about that as well. And obviously the worst case scenario that we also should have in our documentation. What if everything goes wrong? Are we prepared for that? Do we know what to do? What is our first step if things go wrong? So you can take that S.L.O.W model and implement that in your documentation, or you can just print it out and have it somewhere handy and visible, maybe close to your desk. So when you make those decisions, you can have that S.L.O.W model ready and you can have a look whether you went through those points and are you still happy with that decision, or do you need more information? Do you need more time to go through the options again? So before we wrap up, I also mentioned initially that I'm going to talk about negotiation and give you a couple of hints and tips about that process. So let's move on to that. Cognitive bias and negotiation. I decided to talk about just three cognitive biases here. I think they are all interesting, and we probably all experience them in our lives. First one is anchoring. I talked about that one as well. It's that focus on the first piece of information that we are given. In sales, salespeople who are trained, they use that against us. And let's imagine that you want to buy a car and the salesperson asks for $20,000. You negotiate it down to 18 and you feel really proud and happy about that. But what the car's real value is 17,000. The salesperson is really happy because they would probably go to 16.5 or something like that. You are happy as well because you only compare that 18,000 to the initial asking price, which was 20. So when you are about to buy something big and expensive, try to really do your research and know what something is worth. Don't depend on that first piece of information because you will depend on that piece of information. Anchoring bias is actually very difficult to remove. The other situation when that anchoring bias is used is also, for example, salesperson asks for $100. You like the price. You think that what you want to buy is absolutely worth $100. You are happy with it. You move on to a checkout, maybe on a website, and then suddenly it turns out that it's not the final price. There is a service fee and cleaning fee and maybe additional tax. I know at least one well-known accommodation website that I think is using that cognitive bias in a pretty effective way. And suddenly that $100 is now $180, but you still remember that 100 that you liked initially. That's one thing. And the other, you already liked the place and you wanted to book it, so you go ahead with that. Framing is really crucial. How we frame proposal will impact whether that proposal will be accepted or not. And salespeople know that. And it turns out that we are more afraid of a potential loss than we are excited about a potential gain. So how salespeople are using this against us? When you buy a car or a new computer, they might offer you a pretty expensive additional warranty, and they will talk a lot about all of the things that this special warranty is going to cover, and you are not going to lose your shiny new laptop, and if you do, then you have the warranty for additional $400. So framing is really crucial, and framing a proposal as a potential loss is pretty successful and effective. And the last one here is the fixed pie effect. So it's an assumption that both sides of negotiation have very different priorities. In many cases, that might be true, but in many at the same time, it's not really true. When we think back about that car buying situation, both you and the salesperson have the same goal. At the end of the day, you want the car to change the owner. The salesperson doesn't want to own the car, you want to own the car. So the goal is the same. And yes, of course, you want to pay as little as possible, and the salesperson wants to get from that as much as possible. But when you realize that in many cases you have the same goal, and that person on the other side of negotiation is not your enemy, it will be easier to agree on the price or conditions of the sales. So just assuming that they are against you is not right, and it might make the negotiation more difficult than it needs to be. So those were all the things that I wanted to share. But before we wrap up, I have a couple of summary points. Your thinking is biased because everyone's thinking is biased. Cognitive biases are here and they cannot be completely removed. They do exist for a reason. They make our lives easier in many cases. They protect our brain from overheating. And they make a lot of those automated decisions for us out of those 35,000 that we make every day. Bias awareness is a necessary first step. So do read about cognitive biases. That's not going to hurt you, but that's probably not going to be enough on its own. Mitigations are possible and should be personalized. So learn about how you think, but maybe don't overthink every little decision. And that's not actually my advice. That's the same advice that Daniel Kahneman would give you. The effort invested in getting it right should be commensurate with the importance of the decision. Thank you so much. What I have here under this QR code is, don't worry, it's not my LinkedIn profile. It's a list of additional resources. If you would like to make a little more reading about the cognitive bias and that area of cognitive psychology, follow that link and it's going to give you some recommendations. There are also some useful resources to start with metacognition if that's something that you haven't started yet and haven't thought about before this talk. Thank you very much. I hope it was useful and interesting.
Thanks so much, Meg. This is a great talk. You were really thorough in covering, as much as you could in the 40 minutes. And I think we'll have a number of questions that have come in during your talk. I think people are really interested in hearing a little bit more about your own personal experience with cognitive bias. Like, what was the situation that you encountered where you recognized that you did have a bias? What did you do in that circumstance? And what did you eventually learn? And what would you change about the way you handled that?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And I think that I'm, pretty aware of my own limitations and the, really the information, I think, to be humble about your cognitive biases and to accept that it's not something that you can get rid of is helpful. I think for me personally, metacognition is something that is really useful, just understanding how I think. And I think that's going to help everyone a lot if they go through that point and actually focus on thinking about how you think. For me, I think the confirmation bias is the one that I struggle with, because I think that I got to the point that I recognize when I have that bias, when I encounter that, and I know my almost body reaction when I have information that I don't like and I don't want to continue with that. But it's at the same time, it's quite difficult to force yourself to go with that information. More on the political scene probably than product management. The other bias that I struggle with and I try to be better is the planning fallacy one. We know that again and again our projects get underestimated, and obviously the estimation is a team effort. It's not just me or just the development team, but it's something that is just so difficult to get right because yeah, we get optimistic. Most of us are optimistic, which is good because it allows us to not give up, get up when after a failure and continue and so on. So that's actually very helpful and healthy for us. And it's an indication of a well-adjusted personality at the same time. But in product management, it really punishes us every time when we want to have a deadline and want to communicate maybe to customers that this is coming, and then 2 months later it's still in development. So those are the ones that I really try to pay a lot of attention to, and I think I'm getting better with that, but it takes time and patience. It's not something that will happen overnight.
It's great. And I think confirmation bias is one I think that we all kind of like struggle with too, right? Because we're kind of wanting to get to an answer. We kind of have a hypothesis and we're hoping for that like confirmation that it's all. And I think we also use the language, right, too. Even with our research, we talk about validation, right? Rather than talking about learning and understanding sometimes. So it's kind of interesting. I think as a topic for all of us, to be thinking about like which ones sort of resonate with us, which are the ones we probably exhibit the most that we may or may not be aware about. So in terms of like practical techniques, I know you've talked a lot about, the different ways that we could sort of, manage or mitigate our bias as much as possible. What are some of the techniques that you've sort of maybe employed either in sort of your planning or your confirmation bias?
I think generally peer reviewing is really good, and it can help with mitigating some of those biases that we might have on different stages of product management. I guess that working at Pushpay helps with that as well, because we tend to do, we don't fly solo. We tend to do a lot in pairs or in teams. The way, for example, we hire, it's always at least two of us in a room with a candidate. So if one of us will have that halo or horn effect, the hope is that the other one won't have that same effect and will be able to be more objective. So the peer review, implementing a couple of checkpoints in your documentation, even having a section to document risks and not leaving that section empty, that's going to help you document those early thinking, and then later on see whether those risks that you listed early on are actually the risks that happen, or maybe you were completely blind to some of them. So some of them, even though they might not lead to a better outcome for that process, later on in retrospect, they might help you learn more from that process. So, and that's a win, I think, as well.
I love that, like, a lot of your talk has been about, like, it seems like it's just a journey for us, a learning journey, more like thinking about thinking, as we've kind of talked about earlier. And I really love that you shared that with us, because I think, you know, sometimes it's really hard for us, and I think that evaluation, and I think a lot of what you're talking about in terms of techniques to manage it are actually learning and reflecting on what we did, how we came to making those decisions. I would love to get some thoughts. Like, one of the things that I really love that you talked about was about the biases that come into play with the evaluation of success. And what, how do you feel like the environmental factors or company culture kind of play into the fact that we then exhibit these biases of, like, self-serving and survivor bias, the ostrich effect that you had mentioned?
Yeah, definitely huge, I think, impact of company culture. If you work for a company that doesn't want to talk openly about failure and doesn't allow employees to, you know, experience that failure, which we learn so much from them, that bias might be highlighted as well, you know, by that company culture. We don't talk openly about failures, about things that didn't go well. So we tend to focus on that success story and avoid, you know, unpleasant information even more, because that's just part of the culture. So it's, instead of helping us overcome those biases, that company culture can highlight those biases even more and make them more prominent. I don't think I mentioned that during my talk, but that planning fallacy bias quite often is impacted by executives as well. So if you had that experience that you went with a good estimation to your CEO, for example, and said, we can do this, but it's going to take us 4 months. Are you still keen? And they were like, 4 months? No, we need to do it faster. It's not that complicated. Just get it done, right? The next time you will be really hesitant before going with that estimation. And maybe, you know, you will get an estimation from your development team, and you're going to take 1 month away because you don't want that reaction from your CEO, for example. So how they react to us being honest and trying to do a best job will impact that as well.
That's great. We've got some interesting questions that have come up. There's one here from John, our friend in Denver, just asking about whether you think that there's different personality types. So when we think about Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, you know, do you think that there are some that are less prone to bias or more prone to bias?
Yeah, for sure. I think that, you know, if you are someone who is really sensitive about yourself or a bit of a narcissist, all of those hot biases probably will be even more impactful for that personality type. If you are someone who really, you know, is very sensitive about that, that's going to happen. If you are someone who maybe struggles to be more independent, the biases like bandwagon effect, when, you know, you just go with whatever the majority says and you are not able to say yes, you don't have it yet developed as a skill, that's going to be a bias that would be probably more important for someone like that to focus on. So again, that's why the metacognition and not even focusing so much on personality, although that's not going to happen, but just one of the you know, parts of our personality, how we think, how we make decisions, would be so helpful to even start preparing a list of those biases for us and having a personalized list of the biases that we think we might experience more often.
Yeah, certainly an interesting topic to explore more. There's a couple questions here just about, do you think some cognitive biases are good? Like, for example, for faster decision making, reducing cognitive load. When should we try and maybe embrace some of those, and when do we think like, you know, we need to make the decision to sort of try and eliminate those?
Yeah, I think I talked a little bit about that, you know, in general, cognitive biases exist there because they are our way of actually dealing with everything that surrounds us and making those automated decisions. It's really difficult to say, you know, in this situation, go with whatever your intuition tells you. It's that last slide with the quote from Daniel Kahneman that you kind of need to decide whether it's, you know, important enough and whether the consequences of getting that wrong will be important enough to spend more time and try to actually come up with a decision or approach and so on, instead of just going with the intuition. I like this research approach when you map all your assumptions and then you try to map those assumptions to those high impact and low impact. If you get it wrong, what happens? So maybe that's a question you can ask yourself. If I don't get it right, what's going to happen? Like, I'm going to drink tea instead of coffee. Is that the decision? You can just go with your intuition. But if you are thinking about changing completely your pricing plan, then, you know, not getting it right will have significant consequences. And some of them are good biases. I mentioned the optimism bias, or can be good. That's actually one of the biases that just gets us going, right? And that's interesting bias because we are optimistic mostly about our own abilities and about ourselves. So it's something that allows us to feel good about ourselves, to probably agree and take challenges that maybe we shouldn't take on, but we are brave, so we do it, and sometimes we are successful, and that's great. So that's one of the optimism biases. We are not rational, we are optimistic with that bias, but you know, it has many positive outcomes.
That's awesome, Meg. And I'm just going to ask you one last question from the audience here before we wrap up, which is just a little bit about, like, as we try and sort of manage our biases and we're collecting and processing a lot of information, how do you then manage sort of like decision fatigue?
I don't think you can manage decision fatigue. I think we talked a little bit about that at the beginning. I think decision fatigue in a way is something that is part of product management in a way, because we do make a lot of decisions and many of them need to be those system 2 decisions instead of system 1. I think that really making that distinction of what, you know, how much thinking is necessary and just be more confident probably with your craft will mitigate that to some degree. Just knowing more about your product and your customers, you will need less effort to make that decision. Sorry, I was just reading the question. So yeah, so just, you know, like knowing your product, knowing your customers, the more you know, even the decisions that feel like effort, it should be less effort than when you are new completely to your product and your company, and every little decision feels like a huge effort.
That's great. Thank you so much, Meg. I know you've given a lot for all of us to think about as we think about our process and, you know, thinking about the decisions that we're making and how much of the decisions that we're making are part of that coming from our own bias. So I really appreciate the talk today. Thank you so much for pulling that together. I think it's really a start of you know, an engaging conversation that we need to continue to have. And so thank you so much. And I'm going to hand back over to Anthony to wrap up the meeting today.
Thanks everyone, and thanks to the audience for great questions.